Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. Today I'm speaking with Milo Chao, formerly with TBWA China for over 4 years and an expert in residence at Chinaccelerator. He is now the co-founder of Chao & Cao, a Shanghai-based strategic advisory firm established to help foreign brands grow locally and Chinese brands grow internationally. Milo has over 2 decades of marketing and branding experience, much of it in China, which inevitably led to this becoming our longest episode to date. We thoroughly discussed many aspects of China market entry, covering the difficulties of marketing in the auto industry to why the infant milk industry was surprisingly easier. We also talked about whether Chinese consumers care about a brand's CSR activities and social impact status, the importance of maintaining or even investing further in customer service resources for China, and why brands need to invest in revamping their customer profiles from the beginning and relearning customer empathy for the Chinese market. Milo, what's the one brand that people and businesses need to know about in China and why?
So there's one Chinese brand that I find really interesting. It's called 999. It's a cold medicine. And what I find interesting in what they're doing is they are trying to appeal to millennials coming across in their communications not as a cold medicine brand, but as a fashion brand. So they're really breaking out of the mold of what a cold medicine brand should be doing.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Milo, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about how you ended up in China. What's your China story?
My dad's Chinese. My mother's Irish. When I was growing up in New York, my dad never spoke Chinese, but his third wife was Chinese, and they spoke Chinese all the time. And so they would always be, speaking in Chinese, and it was always, I was always curious as to what was going on and what they were saying. So I started studying Chinese in college, and I visited China in 1992 and doing the summer program, and I fell in love with it. It was just a fascinating place.
Okay, so you've got you've got a really, really nice career in doing advertising and branding, and a lot of it is in China. So kind of catch us up to how you got into advertising and branding, where your background is in that, and then how you ended up doing it in China.
Well, I was a lost youth for sure when I was younger. After I graduated from university, I went to Taiwan to study Chinese. And then after 2 years, I went to the Johns Hopkins Nanjing program in Nanjing. And for a year, I was there. And then, I had originally wanted to go into either journalism or the Foreign Service. I did an internship with Reuters, and that was incredible. But, at the end, I didn't get that job. And I was just kind of searching for something, what should I be doing next after graduation? And someone mentioned to me this idea of advertising. I had never, ever thought about it prior to that, right? I mean, I was a political science major. I concentrated in international relations and East Asian studies. Never once thought about advertising. Mm-hmm. I didn't even watch advertising. And then, then I went to Hong Kong for the handover, right? This is in 1997. Yep. The handover from Hong Kong back to China. And, while I was there, I said, okay, so I'll just start, looking for a job in advertising. So I got my resume together and I just, threw it into every mailbox I could at different advertising agencies. And then finally I was, I was at in an elevator bank, and I was talking to a guy, and I said, I just put my yellow envelope in, and I just was looking for a job in advertising, and I got on the elevator with the guy, and I just kept talking to him, telling him why I was interested in advertising. He gives me his card, and he says, call me on Monday. I'll introduce you to the CEO, and we'll see what we can do. And so, next week I got a job at an agency called Gray. And I specifically said I wanted to work in China. I don't want to be in Hong Kong. I want to be in Beijing.
And what year was this?
Just because this was in 1997.
Oh, same year. Okay.
It's 1997. And then I did some time in Hong Kong and then shipped myself up to Beijing to start my career in advertising, I guess. There I worked on, pedigree dog food. I worked on Holiday Inn. I launched Starbucks in China. And so it was an exciting time. Very different from where it is today, but it was sort of the really early days of advertising in China.
Okay, so you have to talk to us about that, because I think that is a really, really cool. You've been there 22 years now. What was advertising?
No, I've left China, right? I spent 3 years there.
Oh.
So 97, 98, 99.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was almost there. I was there for about almost 3 years. And then I went back to the United States and took up, a job in advertising in New York at the same agency at Gray.
Oh, okay. So then you have another world of experience over there. And what was it? What was your role? In Beijing, you were doing foreign brands. You talked about pedigree dog foods and whatnot. In New York, what was the role there?
I was working on Dow Corning at the time. I think it was Dow Corning. Now it's the chemical company. And I was doing work there, and we were doing some work with China, actually. So China, there was a company called Three Gun, which is a very famous Chinese brand, very kind of classical Chinese brand. It's a clothing brand, like more kind of like Hanes, for instance, the underwear brand. And so we were, Dow Corning was producing sort of some chemical for this brand that would make the product a lot more breathable or a lot more kind of easy to clean. Okay,
so you spent some time in advertising in Beijing, then you go back to New York, you're doing more advertising in New York. What happened then? I mean, at some point you must have gone through some sort of life events that ended up leading you back to China. What happened?
I went back to New York. I was an account executive in the New York office of Gray, and I realized that wasn't really my thing. So I decided, let me go to grad school, get a master's degree in marketing communications, and then make a shift to planning, right? Strategic planning. So I applied. I got accepted. I went to Northwestern, did got my degree, master's degree, and then I moved down to Dallas, Texas, where there was a very famous planner who was starting up the planning department of a very data-driven company. I joined her, worked there for 3 years. During that time, I got married. My wife was, not really excited about Dallas, and so an opportunity came up in Singapore. We moved to Singapore. I took a job with DDB, which is a fantastic advertising agency, and I worked there for 4 years. And I moved to Hong Kong, take up the role of head of planning for Hong Kong. And I worked a lot with Guangzhou, with clients there, a lot with Wrigley, the Wrigley business mostly. And then after 3 years, I moved up to Beijing to work on Volkswagen, and did 2 years there.
What year was what year was the move to Beijing?
The move to Beijing was in 2010.
Okay.
It's actually the exact same time that I had our daughter, who's now 8.
Okay.
Interestingly, the company had offered to pay for an MBA, and so I was already started to take the MBA at the Kellogg School of Management and the Hong Kong Science and Technology University in Hong Kong, and they said, we'll gladly pay for that, but we need you to move to Beijing. So I moved to Beijing, with my newborn baby. And then 2 years later, after working on Volkswagen, I moved down to Shanghai, where I've been since then. So I've been in Shanghai now for 7 years.
Right. And at some point you left. I may have missed. When did you join TBWA?
I joined TBWA probably in 2013.
Okay.
And worked there for about 4 years. Yeah.
Okay. So would it be fair to say that a lot of your work has been helping foreign brands with their strategy and planning and marketing in China?
Absolutely. I mean, that's primarily. I've worked on mostly foreign brands, although I have done some work for local brands as well. I've done some interesting work with local brands. I think they can be somewhat challenging. I've worked with Qingdao beer. I've worked a little bit on Huawei, done a little bit on ZTE, which is a state-owned enterprise which does, mostly electronics and technology products, and some other smaller brands. I've worked with some cold medicine brands and other things like that. So, yeah, I've got my fair share or a good amount of experience with local brands, but primarily, international brands.
What was a really, really tough industry that you remember trying to work on?
Well, auto is a very, very tough industry, actually. I've done work with Volkswagen. I've done work with Nissan. I've done work with Ford and Lincoln. And it is an incredibly challenging world because, it's such a competitive market, and there are so many conventions that, everyone sort of has these kind of blinders on, thinking that this is how you do advertising, And so when you look at the market, you can see that, auto advertising is essentially the same. I mean, there occasionally is some slight variations, but because of the, the amount of money that is invested in the marketing, I mean, they put in serious money into marketing in the auto industry. They don't take risks very often. So occasionally they do, and with mixed results. But I think it's one of the most challenging markets. And it's not just about marketing, right? Because I think there's a lot of there's pricing issues you have to wrestle with. There's distribution issues that are hugely impactful. So, yeah.
What did you find that was easier than you thought it would be for an industry or for a particular campaign that you might have worked on? Where did you find that, surprisingly, this is actually a good spot to be doing this, and this is actually going better than I thought it might?
Well, I actually, interestingly, found working on infant milk formula to be quite engaging and interesting. I don't know if that's the question you're asking, but I'll pursue it a little bit. I found working with infant milk formula to be really interesting because when you are thinking about that industry, you're actually thinking about the future of China, right? Now, what does that mean, right? Because when you are thinking about infant milk formula, you're actually thinking about the relationship between mother and child. You're thinking about what that mother wants for that child. What are the expectations that mother has for the child? What are the things and the pressures around her that are kind of forcing her to kind of move in one direction or another, right? I'll give you just some for instances, right? There was almost there was a year where there was almost a kind of an arms race for DHA, right, which is this chemical that is supposed to make your child much smarter, right? So, one company would say we have 500, amount of DHA, and another one say we have thousands, of DHA, and we have 10,000s of DHA, right? And so it was just this kind of arms race of like who has more DHA, and so it's really about finding ways to really be creative in the way you kind of market or position yourself in this category, and there was one brand came along, Illuma, which is a super premium brand of infant milk formula, and they just kind of broke out of that, and they said, it's not about the formula, although it's about the formula. But they said it's about, releasing your child, giving your child freedom, allowing them to explore their creative side and see, and that, message along with their formula, really played well with mothers who are kind of looking for a much more kind of progressive approach to motherhood, looking for an alternative to the sort of, rote, memorization, the whole idea that, kids are just being, stuffed with information and they're not free. And so we're really playing into this kind of aspiration of what motherhood should be and what the future of China's, competitive nature will be, all from infant milk formula.
What were some of the biggest challenges you faced in trying to convert them into having the right philosophy or approach to what they were about to engage in?
So I think the interesting thing about, working with, and I've worked with a lot of foreign companies trying to get into China, big and small, right? And, American, Australian, European. I think one of the interesting things is that most foreign brands will come into China with this, belief that they need to be super Chinese, right? They need to be almost more Chinese than Chinese. In some ways, they are willing to sacrifice their own core for, trying to be relevant to a Chinese consumer. And I think what's most important for foreign brands coming into China is to think about, okay, so what is the essence of what I'm all about? What has enabled me to succeed in my own country, right? What is the universal that, I can kind of deploy in China that I could deploy anywhere, right? Yes, it's a foreign country. Yes, it's kind of this sort of, big land that they don't understand. But that does not mean that you just forego the strengths that you had in other countries, right? I think the ones that are most successful are the ones who are able to say, okay, this is the essence of what I am. This is what my core strength is. And now I just need to find a way to make that relevant to the Chinese consumer. And I think that's really where I think the rubber hits the road, or really where the thinking needs to happen, right? Which is, this is who I am. Now, how can I make that relevant to the Chinese consumer, and how can I make it myself different from all the competitors that are in the marketplace today, right? And in the past, it used to just be about being relevant to or being distinct from other foreign brands. But today, increasingly, you have to distinguish yourself also from the local brands who are, becoming much more competitive, who are, responding much more rapidly to shifts, probably understand consumers at a much more kind of almost intuitive level than foreigners. I remember reading an article once in Chinese about, three very famous Chinese CEOs who met and talked about working, or competing against foreign brands. And they said that ultimately, the problem with foreign brands is that they have to, call their boss back in Dusseldorf, or call their boss back in New York or London. to try to, work things out, and it takes too long. For us, these are our local CEOs. We can turn on a dime, right? We can make shifts, in seconds, and make massive shifts in seconds, right? And so, I think that's sort of, an issue that foreign brands have to wrestle with, meaning to say that, it's not just foreign competition that they're wrestling with, it's local competition as well.
I was going to say, and that's a great segue, I think that we know now that the cachet of being a foreign brand isn't paying the dividends that it used to when you enter a market like China. How has the competitive landscape changed as far as not just the consumer, but as far as the competition? How have you seen recently in the last 5 years, till now, how have you seen the competitive nature of companies really up their game or their sophistication in what they're doing and how they're reaching out and creating a relationship with customers?
I think I think every brand is struggling, right? I don't think there's any brand that is just breezing through marketing, breezing through, making money. I think, but I think certain brands have advantages because they have kind of an intuitive sense of what needs to happen. They have an intuitive kind of connection with, the consumer base, right? But obviously, I think most important is understanding all the platforms that are really popular and understanding how to use them and creating the right content that kind of they can push out to consumers, and trying things, right? And I think there's certain brands are a little bit more conservative and certain brands are actually much more risk taking. And I think probably the younger brands are much more open to taking risks. And I think foreign brands need to kind of, open up, relax a little bit, and sort of really just kind of take off the gloves, right? I mean, take off the gloves and get into the ring and start pounding, right? I think, you have to, it's a war zone. I mean, it's a huge battle, and you have to be fighting like, it's not like, the British, redcoats, just marching down the road. I mean, you have to go guerrilla. And I think the Chinese brands are doing a lot better job at going guerrilla. And I think foreign brands need to just kind of take off their jackets and say, let's try to find ways where we can just kind of do it, in a way that we can really reach consumers. And in some ways it may be off-brand, but we need to do what works. And I think that's sort of, something to be said about Chinese brands and Chinese consumers or Chinese people in general. I think they are less inhibited by kind of these constraints of, what our brand is and what our brand should and should not do. I think there's just a desire to sort of do what needs to be done to, win.
Is the Chinese consumer measuring the impact globally that a company is having, say, on the earth, on the environment? Are they paying more attention to CSR pillars of a company or what they stand for? And is that impacting the loyalty a customer has to a brand?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think there are definitely research studies that are coming out that speak to, a greater consciousness and
That's
openness, a
good way of putting it. Yeah.
And requirement for, a greener product, healthier products. Again, I would separate those two things, right?
Yeah,
where between wellness and or even health and like global impact, right? Because global impact is very macro. It's very kind of other. Mm-hmm. As opposed to wellness and health, which is about me. It's going to impact me. Mm-hmm. And so I think Chinese consumers are definitely concerned about the impact products have on them individually and on their, friends and their family. Now, the question is, are they that concerned about the impact these products are having on, carbon emissions or pollution? I would say, yes, they are within, the confines of their community, like for instance, whether it be Beijing or Shanghai or Guangzhou or some of these larger cities, probably even some of the smaller cities, they do care about pollution because it's so visible, right? So they do care, and I think that does have an impact on their thinking about their purchasing. But are we at the stage where, Chinese consumers are like, well, I only buy products that are, are not animal tested. I only buy products that, I don't think we're there yet.
No.
I don't think we're there at that level of, concern or care, because I don't think they do think about those things, right? I don't think they think about the other. I think they think about the me. And when it comes to, pollution, when it comes to any of these things that, animal testing or kind of, certain chemicals, that is probably there at the very kind of highest levels at within the first tier cities, amongst, Chinese who have traveled overseas, who've lived overseas, who've studied overseas. And I think it's amongst those people that level of consciousness is coming. And of course, I think there are some kind of native-born concerns about that. I think particularly with people who are, just very sensitive, very intellectual, very kind of aware of these issues. People maybe who may be even spiritual. I think those types of people are much more kind of switched on and concerned about, these issues.
Let me ask another question, and I apologize if it gets a little complicated or confusing, because there's kind of 4 points in here, but I want to ask, how sophisticated is the Chinese consumer when it comes to a brand being authentic? And how has that changed or grown up over the last 5 years? And how much do foreign brands need to pay attention to being authentic when they enter China? And how much of a problem is it for them to be able to do that?
Good question. I think that, the interesting thing about, authenticity, I think you need to define what that means. But okay. I think the conversation about authenticity starts with products that are real or fake, right? That are fake, and then you can break it down to, are they safe or are they unsafe? Are they dangerous? Are they toxic, right? Historically, or at least in the last, 10 or so years, there's been a lot of cases where people have become very sick or even died because things were fake, right? Now, we're talking about authenticity on a product level. So I think that is, obviously, people care about that. And again, it's about the me, right? It's about the, they think about authenticity from that perspective. Now, another question is like, on a branding level of authenticity, do they care about brands that are kind of, are all about truth, are all about kind of, not being, just bullshitting them? I think the younger consumer has a bullshit radar, right? Mm-hmm. And I think they are, I think there's a move towards or away from, I'll say, for instance, within the auto industry, right? There is definitely a move away from this kind of highfalutin language that they typically use in Chinese, right? Where it feels like it's language that is coming from the emperor. It feels like language that is, from ancient literature. It's poetic, right? And it's interesting because we've done focus groups where we've asked people, what do you think of this language? She says, well, I don't understand it, but it sounds really sophisticated, regal, right? Yeah. So but I think there is definitely a move towards. There's a phrase in Chinese. It's called 接地气, and 接地气 just means very kind of down to earth, right? Mm-hmm. And I think there is definitely a move for marketers to, and consumers to want things to be very grounded, right? And they're kind of getting tired of things that are, just kind of up in the air, making these big promises and, don't bullshit me. Let's just be real, right? And you talk about, authenticity. It's about being real. And I think, you also need to get real when you go down to, the lower tiers, because they're less sophisticated, I suppose you could say. I mean, arguably less sophisticated, and they're much more direct, right? So this is kind of a third aspect of authenticity, which is about just being very direct, not trying to kind of, beat around the bush or try to be kind of clever or try to be poetic. It's just about being very direct, being very kind of specific to their environment, and really speaking to a truth about them, right? So when you talk, when you communicate, it sounds to them that you truly understand them, right? And again, I think that's part of an element of authenticity. So to answer your question as simply as the answer is yes. There is definitely a demand for authenticity, but again, authenticity needs to be broken down, and it can be complex. So you do need to, as a brand, you need to think about, what does authenticity mean to me or for me across my marketing levers.
Is there a unique definition of what it means for a brand to come into China and be authentic, unique to China?
Well, I think there's, as I said, I think there's some complexity towards, the idea of authenticity.
That's right.
Like, you can have a brand that comes into China and is exactly like they were in Canada, exactly like they were in France, right? And they haven't made any adjustments to the local market. And you could argue that that's authentic. Yes, it's authentic, but it's not necessarily relevant, right? I think there is a what you need to do is you need to be true to who you are, but at the same time, you need to be relevant to the people you're talking to, right? So if I was authentic, all I do is have my menus in French, right? I mean, that's authentic, but it puts people off because it's in French and I don't understand it, and it comes across as pretentious, right? And disrespectful. And I think that idea of respecting the Chinese is very important, right? And, you look at some of the more successful brands. If you look at, for instance, you look at Kentucky Fried Chicken, which has a wonderful case study on localization. If you go into a KFC here in China, for instance, you will see that, it almost, the menu looks almost unrecognizable from what's in the States, for instance, right? Totally. Because they have localized. And I think fast food or just food in general is very specific to China in the sense that you need to cater to their palate, right? I think fashion is a little bit more flexible, but if you're talking about, food, I think Chinese have their palate, and they kind of, if you're talking about something they go to on a daily basis, you need to kind of speak to their everyday palate as opposed to, their exploratory palate, right? The one where they may venture into a French restaurant, they may venture into a Romanian restaurant, although I don't know if there's any Romanian restaurants. But my point is that, there's a time to be kind of, adventurous, and there's a time to be everyday. And if you're everyday, you need to find a way to kind of cater to the local palate and the local necessities. So I think you can kind of need to juggle that as opposed to just coming in not adjusted whatsoever.
Right. So after 22 years of advertising touch points with China, what are the biggest changes you've seen?
Let me take you back to my starting point in China, so you can get a sense of where advertising was and where advertising is today. One of my first clients was Pedigree dog food, and one of the first things we had to do was redesign their packaging. We weren't doing any advertising at the time because, one, you weren't allowed to put anything on television where you're selling dog food. It's offensive to a population. Remember, back in 1997, you still had a large percentage of the Chinese population living in abject poverty, right? And so for you to kind of advertise that stuff would be, incredibly offensive. Also, the type of dogs people had were quite limited, and there was a lot of restrictions. But one of the things that we had to do, and I think it's just a fascinating story for me to tell, which is we had to redesign the packaging. Why? Because people thought that what we were selling was dog meat, right? So it was dog food.
I get it.
But a lot of people would come into the stores and they were thinking, oh, this is dog meat. They didn't buy it because no one wants to eat dog meat. But they just like, well, that's weird. Or, I'm not interested in that. So I think the level of understanding at that time about products was just very, very low, right? 1997. I mean, we're still, at a very, very early stage of China's development. But today, I mean, the level of sophistication of Chinese consumers, the level of sophistication of the way in which we market is just incredible. Leaps and bounds beyond what was back in 1997. And in fact, in some ways, I would say that, it's more sophisticated than what you see in the United States. And I think, consumers here in China are incredibly, I guess, digital savvy. I mean, I guess I don't know what that really means, but I think, they have so many options, so many choices, that they're, somewhat snobbish about, the products they buy into, and it is definitely a consumer's market, right? In the sense that, brands have to really fight for their wallets, fight for their yuan, right? I mean, they have to offer new services, offer new products on add-ons and promotions and all of these things to drive a connection to consumers.
Part of what you were saying made me think that customer service for a brand, how important is customer service important in China? How important is it? Has it always been important? Has it grown up in importance? Is it a thing now? And is it an important thing for foreign brands going into China to bring with them when they go?
I think that's an understatement. I think the importance of customer service is incredibly important, right? And I would say that Chinese local companies are incredibly good at customer service. They will bend over backwards for their customers, right? And they offer, services that are just delightful, right? I mean, surprising and delightful. I mean, these are the things that we talk about are kind of qualities of great services when you surprise and delight people. And I think the Chinese have really become incredibly good at this. And the reason why is because one, Chinese consumers have no issue with complaining. They are the great complainers, right? They will, if you do not give them exactly what they expected, they will complain. If something's broken, they will complain. And here's the thing: because of Taobao, because of social media, the brand owners are fearful that there will be retribution, where there will be, a consumer who will write a bad review, or the consumer who will give them, a 1 star or no stars. It's incredibly important for, brands to get good reviews. If they don't get good reviews, it can destroy their business, right? I've heard stories of where brands have gone back to a consumer and pleaded with them to change their review because they know if they have a bad review, they're going to get killed because Chinese people, at least a lot of Chinese consumers, care about reviews, right? They follow where the majority are going. And I'm not saying that they're, sheep. just following the herd.
Right.
But it's really the wisdom of crowds, right? Which is that if a lot of people are sort of going there, buying that, then it must be good. And, and word of mouth, as you know, is hugely important, right? I mean, word of mouth can either make or break a brand. And it has in the past, done incredible things for brands. And again, service is also a competitive advantage, right? It is something that, consumers can or brands can use to differentiate them from other competitors. There's obviously the famous case of Haidilao, which is, a hot pot brand. In fact, the hot pot, it's no better than other hot pots, where you have the spicy kind of cauldron of juices and you add meat and vegetables and things like that into it. But they've done an incredible job with their service. They've turned service into part of what their product offering, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're waiting online, and in fact, I think, a lot of these innovations come from frustrations, right? Most innovations,
Sure.
most inventions come from frustrations. And I think one of the problems is that when people are waiting online, if they're frustrated, if they're not distracted, they're going to get upset, right? And they're going to start, moaning about, how long we have to wait. We have to wait for another half hour. You have to wait. So what Haidilao did is they created nail services, right? You can get your nails done while you wait, or you can play backgammon, or you can, eat this watermelon, or you can get a back rub, right? So I think these services came from frustrations or fear of frustration. So they kind of thought, okay, how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve this problem? And so I think Chinese have done an incredible job of offering these services. And it's the little things, right? Even like when you go on Taobao, for instance, you order some product and, I'll order a shelf, right? I'll order a shelf from, some vendor on Taobao, and it'll come in its parts, but they'll also provide you with a hammer and a screwdriver. Why? Because they know Chinese consumers don't actually have these things in their home. They don't have a toolbox. The average Chinese consumer does not have a toolbox. And so they include the equipment. And that's what that means is the brand understands what Chinese people want, right? Understands what they have, what they don't have. And it's not something, if an American brand, let's say Lowe comes in, right? And, they sell, a chair or, a desk or something like that.
Yeah.
They're not going to include a hammer. Why? No. Because they think, everybody has it. It's just like the Americans. And that's where you kind of fall down.
Right.
That's where, the average, you're going to have to do your research. You're going to have to understand the habits and the way Chinese people kind of live their lives.
I think IKEA,
when you introduce your product.
Yeah, IKEA was a good example because they instilled the not just the delivery, but also the construction and setup of and then things really took off for them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of it. I mean, that's the story, and I think that's the story of a lot of brands, which is that they have to adjust themselves to what Chinese people want, as opposed to this is our business model, right? This is our business model, and we can't change our business model. And IKEA is a perfect example of saying, look, we have to adjust our business model if we want to succeed in China, and then they did, and that helped them. So it's not. So I think the question is, what is at the essence of your brand, right? Is it the fact that people have to kind of build the furniture themselves? Is that the essence of who you are? If you believe that is, then you're not going to succeed in China.
So when you're working with brands that are coming to China, and you inspired me to ask this, how important is it, and how much do you have to emphasize to brands coming to China that they kind of need to throw out their current KYC, their current know your customer profile? How important is it for them to allocate the resources to completely redo their KYC?
When you come into China, my question will always be, have you done research on your consumer here in China? Oftentimes, if it's a large company, they will have done a global study where they are comparing and contrasting different markets and looking at consumers across different markets. I think that is a good start, but I think you always need to go deeper. And I think most brands are do that, where they will kind of actually speak to their consumer. I have been in situations where, clients or brands will not have done any significant research on the local customer, thinking that their product is, really great, and if they are able to distribute it, it'll just sell like hotcakes, and that's the case sometimes. I think Tesla probably has that luxury, but I think a lot of brands will not have that luxury. So they really need to be able to kind of really empathize and find ways to sort of understand who their customer is. And for me, personally, it's kind of a bear bug for me, which is I am really bothered when foreign brands come into the market, or foreign clients come into the market, not knowing, respecting, or caring about the consumer here. And I would say it's probably less the case today than it was, where there was almost a condescension, right? Where there was like, these customers are so low that I don't really connect with them, so I don't really understand them. And when you're in a situation where you don't respect, where you don't care to know your consumer, where you do care not to understand their motivations, I think you're going to lose. I think you're going to fail in the marketplace, right? Because I think consumers will probably feel that at some level, right? And it's not about trying to understand their whole psychological composition, right? I mean, it's not about that necessarily, but I think you need to get to a level of empathy, right? Where you feel you understand their needs, you understand their motivations, and therefore you're able to kind of massage or, reposition or kind of fine tune your position so it fits nicely with the consumer, right? It's not about throwing out things necessarily, but it is about kind of making adjustments. And I would say also that I think a lot of brands, particularly global brands, what they try to do is try to find the lowest common denominator, where their American consumer, their Canadian consumer, their French consumer, and their Chinese consumer will all share one certain thing in common, and therefore let's just try to work with that. So I would say don't do that. I think you should try to be to really start from China, as opposed to trying to fit it into a global model that you're trying to fit neatly into a PowerPoint presentation.
What is one thing you found brands underestimated when they came to enter China, and one thing, maybe even more interestingly, that they overestimated when they were looking to come to China?
There are different clients. There are clients who are incredibly arrogant, and there are clients who are incredibly humble. Mm-hmm. And I think it's about finding a middle ground. And I know that's not your question, but I think it's about finding a middle ground of kind of trying to observe and view China, right? Because I think if you come in too humble, you're going to get stepped over. Yeah. I think if you're going to come in too arrogant, you're going to be blind. But if you're kind of in the middle, you can hold on to who you are, but also keep your eyes wide open, right? And I think that's an incredibly important position to have when you're in China, right? Because it does bother me when I see two parts, right? When you come into China being very weak and kind of humble and being very politically correct and kind of like, I respect you, it gets to you become so respectful that you lose your backbone. Right. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's sort of like, what's going on in the U.S., where everyone's so damn PC that, no one's telling the truth anymore. Right. Everyone's just kind of, shutting up. But I think you need to come in confident, but you cannot come in arrogant. I think that's definitely a sign of death is soon to come. But getting back to your question about what are clients overestimating or underestimating, I think they often underestimate the sophistication of competitors, local competitors.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a major issue that I think clients do not understand. But I think that's changing. I think they're starting to realize that there are local brands that are just doing a really good job. And I think what that means is that we need to study local brands as well, right? This isn't about local brands studying the foreign brands anymore. It's about foreign brands having to kind of study the behaviors and the kind of the strategies and the tactics of local brands as well as the foreign brands. I think that's really important. And I think that, so my point is that I think they do underestimate local brands. They may be smaller in certain instances, and they may not even have a product as good as their product, right? The quality might not be that good, but you know what? They're selling a hell of a lot more product. You know why? Because they understand the consumer, right? Like there's, I think Siemens was, there's a few brands in the kind of the home, like I guess the ovens, and one of the things that one of the Chinese brands is that they put some pretty serious fires on their ovens, right? Because when Chinese people cook, I mean, they put that fire up, right? Because they want to, when they stir fry, they stir and they fry, right? So, and the exhaust, I mean, they need that to be super powerful, right? And, it's the local brands like Robam and Laoban and other brands like that who have been able to sort of understand how Chinese people cook. Right. And I think foreign brands are coming slowly towards that. But again, Westerners cook differently than Chinese, and you need to kind of adjust. So, you can't just always, assume that you bring in your high quality product that's going to sell. So I think overestimate. I think in most instances, I think it's about, not appreciating how complex China is. And how sophisticated the social media is, and how challenging social media is, and how sophisticated e-commerce is, and how important e-commerce is.
Sounds like a general underestimation. Most of it is underestimating.
The fact of the matter is, you're not. I mean, and here's another thought, which is, if you're going to compete in China, you got to be in China, right? You cannot, direct the boat from, New York headquarters. You really can't. You need to be in the market. Like, for instance, for me, I used to, live in Hong Kong for 3 years, but I would work in China. But to be honest, even if I'm in Hong Kong, I do not understand the market unless I'm in China. Because when you're in China, you're surrounded by Chinese people. And you're living with them, and you're understanding what their pains are, what their needs are, what the new products are coming out, and what news of the day was just getting a lot of hype. And so, if you're going to try to win in China, you got to be in China, right? If you're going to fight in the battle, you got to be on the battlefield.
What do you think is the one thing that Western brands or foreign brands could learn from the Chinese brands?
The Chinese are not perfectionists, right? At least not now, right? And, and if you're trying to get everything right, if you're trying to get all your communications right, if you're trying to get your product absolutely right, perfect in every regard, cross every T and dot every I, you're not going to get there. You can't. You gotta be more agile, which is interesting because this idea of kind of like, fail fast. I mean, Silicon Valley's kind of throwing that idea out. Chinese are all about that. It's about fail fast, move fast. It doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, it doesn't need to actually always be very incredibly good. It just needs to be good enough. Right? And that's actually, it's an interesting one because good enough, it has two sides to it. It can be seen as that's good, or it can be seen as that's evil, right? Good enough just means, we haven't put so much money, so much investment into it, but you know what? That's okay. It'll sell, right? And most consumers will say, that's good enough is good enough, right? And I think sometimes when foreign brands come in, they do their R&D, and I think they should be thinking about R&D. They need to think about is this good enough, or do they want to push it a little bit further? And the question is, if you push it a little bit further, is that going to make that much difference? And usually the answer to that question is no, it's not going to make that much of a difference. Mm-hmm. And I think also one of the things that Chinese brands tend to do is in the absence of, true invention or true innovation, they'll put a lot of things around it, like add-ons or, features or added services. And I think those kind of add-ons and those value adds are really important. And you can think about it on that level as well. And I think, Chinese brands do a very good job of that. And I think foreign brands can do that as well. And so there's other areas, not just the product itself, that can be sources of competitive advantage.
What is your favorite piece of advice to give to foreign brands looking to come to China?
My advice would be to really spend the time to find the right people to build your business, to create your business in China. Don't just stop at the first person who speaks really good English, the person who, you just feel a strong connection with immediately, right? Try to find the person who has done the work before, who has experience in that area, who's executed it before. Find the person who has connections, the person who is connected to the ground, right? I think that's so important. People who, roll their sleeves up, people who are able to talk to the distributors, who are able to talk to and have talked to, the people on the ground, right? Don't just get someone who's highly educated, who speaks amazing English. Talk to the people who've done the work, who've gone into the battlefield, who've fought the fights.
That is excellent advice from an excellent person who has some of the longest tenure and experience in China. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show, Milo.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands, just like yours, enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co. And be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. 再见。